Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Aiza Umar. The Jerusalem Magistrates Court accepted a request by the Israeli Attorney General to renew the closure of Al-Aqsa Mosque compound's Rehma Gate in East Jerusalem, one of the several mosques located in Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque complex. Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest place of worship for Muslims. The Bab al-Rehma Mosque was first closed by the Israeli authorities in 2003. In 2017, an Israeli court renewed the closure order. Now, by mid-February, due to heavy Palestinian protests, Jerusalem's Religious Endowments Authority, which is basically a Jordan-run agency mandated with overseeing the city's Islamic and Christian holy sites, had to reopen the mosque. Now, the Israeli court's decision has drawn, again, a lot of criticism at a time when the world is already reeling from what has happened to Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand last Friday, where a white Australian male shot down 50 people in a gun rampage through two mosques. Why was there a need for this closure now? What has caused it, especially at such a critical time? And how much of it is contributed to the larger narrative of whether it's white supremacy, if at all connected? And how far can we go in connecting the dots to Israel's discrimination against Muslim Palestinians and Arabs in their territory? Now, let me introduce our guests. First, we have Dr. Khalid Qudimi. You are the representative of Hamas Tehran chapter, and he will be joining us from Tehran. And also an analyst, Mr. Ahmed Al-Oglu. He is not only a lecturer at different universities, but has written for leading newspapers around the world. I want to welcome both of you for joining us here at Newswire. Let me start with you, Mr. Ahmed. First of all, just to try and bring into context for our viewers from around the world who are watching this. This is not the first time, obviously, this has happened. And this is an ongoing situation as we understand it. But could you highlight for us the timeline of how this contentious issue of access to Al-Aqsa Mosque has evolved over the years?
Well, the Israeli occupation, first of all, thank you for having me. And the Israeli occupation, since it occupied Palestine, historic Palestine, is trying from now to then to practice its more oppressive and occupying policies against the Holy Mosque of Al-Aqsa. They've tried this at the time of Ariel Sharon when he invaded the compound, and that erupted an intifada among the Palestinians. So it's not the first time, but recently what was important, to be honest, is the emboldenment that the Israeli occupation got from the recent administration in the United States. What Donald Trump did is unprecedented when it comes to the relocation of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, in a sign or in a gesture that was sent to the Israelis that the United States, that for a long time have been perceived as the broker of peace, as an impartial mediator for peace process between the Palestinians and the Israelis, is now giving them the green light to do whatever they want. And with the complete silence of the Muslim world, especially, and the Sunni in particular, that also gave the Israelis another green light that they can go ahead with their provocation against the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinian people in Jerusalem feel completely alienated by this government, in the Arab League, in the whole region, or also in the Muslim world. But on the other hand, they believe that with their own hands, with the momentum they can produce, with the pressure they can practice on the Israeli occupation, they succeeded a couple of weeks ago to open the door of Al-Rahma, Bab al-Rahma, that it used to be closed since 2003, as you've alluded in your intro. Now, what's happening is the Israeli government that is trying to say that it's democracy, where they have different executive, judicial powers, completely independent from each other. Mm-hmm. Now their court is supporting the closure of the gate once again, in a move that is going to provoke, more hatred sentiments among the Palestinians, especially at the time when we have this kind of attack against the Muslim holy places and, like mosques. What happened in New Zealand recently is also is not a kind of a coincidence that all of this is happening at the same time.
Right. And Dr. Khalid, let me bring you into this conversation. When the U.S. endorses Israel's actions, however discriminating they are towards the Arabs, the Palestinians, the oppressed there in occupied Israel, it's no surprise to the world. But this point that our guest just brought up, where is the Muslim world's reaction on this? Are they united enough to raise a voice?
Firstly, greetings to you, to your guests and your audiences, and my heartiest condolences to the victims of the criminal act of New Zealand shooting, especially since I'm talking to you in Pakistan. My sincere and heartiest condolences to the families and to the families of the victims, Pakistani 9 victims of that criminal terrorist shooting. Actually, again, our shrines and our countries are victim of the state terrorism sponsored by United States of America and the Israeli enemy state. Asking about Muslims, this Bab al-Rahma has been closed, as you've said, for the last 16 years, and it has been reopened not by any ministry or any government. It has been reopened by the masses, by the loyal people, by the common man in the street in Al-Quds and in Palestine. They have decided to move there because they have sensed, they were concerned and worried about the plans of the Israeli enemy to have the spatial and temporal division of Al-Aqsa Mosque, a plan which has initiated few years ago, and we have witnessed last year how our people, great people of Palestine, has broken those iron electronic gates to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which has been planned previously by the Israeli government to have the control over the mosque. The Ministry of Endowment in Jordan has to carry its own responsibility. We've been learned by some resources that there are talks between the Israeli governments and the Jordanian governments over the incident to diffuse the activities in Al-Rahma Gate and in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Let me just tell you that only 1 hour ago, 53 Israeli settlers they broke into Al-Aqsa Mosque with the guard of the Israeli army. So you're talking about the Muslims, then there is no action because of the lack of unity, as you have just mentioned, because of the priorities are different, and because they are unfortunately going with the other plans with the Israeli government through the normalization of relations. The Palestinian. Yes,
so let me bring in Mr. Ahmed here. Mr. Ahmed, obviously there is an international law. It immediately decries what Israel's court has even moved. They're not allowed to touch these holy sites, as my understanding is. Correct me if I'm wrong. So when Israel even the occupation of East Jerusalem in itself is against international law after the Arab-Israel War of '67. Could you shed some light on whose mandate it is, whose authority it is to stop Palestinians from entering this holy site?
That's a very brilliant question. That's the 1 million issue, to be honest. What's happening is, by default, the Israeli presence in East Jerusalem is against the international law, against the United Nations resolutions, where they asked them to withdraw from the borders of the 1967. And still, Israel, as a rogue state that sees itself above the law, does not show any respect to the international regulations, to the United Nations resolutions, is still acting as if it's a completely living in a different planet, does not respect any of these sentiments of the 1.6 or 7 billion Muslims around the world. Also, it doesn't respect the laws of the United Nations. We recently seen their envoy to the United Nations tearing up the manifesto of the UNICEF, because it says that the Israelis do not have any relation to the place that they're now occupying in East Jerusalem. It's basically a Muslim holy place. They should not be there by the first hand. Now, what's happening is we are not in a fair and just world. What's happening, as President Erdogan of Turkey is always reiterating, bigger than five. The problem with the United Nations that is not respected because it's still in the hand of the five powers, including the United States, that is acting unequivocally against the Palestinians. And that's very clear from the recent measures that Donald Trump is taking, from the recent moves he is taking on the ground, the unequivocal support of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner.
No, that is something that we're all very well aware of, Mr. Ahmed, but it just brings into context why this is happening time and again. Is there the question of disunity amongst the Palestinians themselves, especially what we are seeing with the the new Prime Minister coming in for the PA?
Look, this is a pretext that they always use. I mean, the Israelis are always using that the Palestinians are not united. Look at the West Bank. In the West Bank, they have Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, where they're completely cooperating with them. And on the other hand, what is the Israeli doing? They're annexing more land. They're expanding the illegal settlements in the West Bank. They're evacuating and forcibly evicting lots of Bedouins from their villages. And all of this is also a violation of the international law, because the West Bank is also an occupied territory according to the United Nations resolution. So why this is happening and why at this particular time? I've told you the first reason is, one, because it's an occupation. By default, the occupation power, the occupying power, will practice these kind of policies on the ground. And second, because of the hypocrisy of the international law, because of the international powers, especially the United States, is not doing what is supposed to be doing.
It almost seems that as if it almost seems, sorry to cut you there, that international law never really applied to this region of the world, because whenever it comes to whatever Israel does, irrespective of what law it breaks, the very pretext that it exists is against international law. It doesn't seem to matter. The world goes on. Dr. Khalid, again, this question to you, the disunity that we see in political factions representing the Palestinians, does this not add fuel to the fire that the Israelis take advantage of?
I agree to what have been said by Professor Oglu and what you have just said. The international law has no power to implement the resolution has been passed against the Israeli atrocities in Jerusalem even. You know, that UNESCO has announced that there is no relation to Jewish religion even, to Al-Aqsa Mosque in particular and vicinity. So this has nothing to do with the Israelis, because Israelis are not concerned at all with something called human rights, international law, or international legitimacy.
It almost seems like, Dr. Khalid,
I want just to comment, because this is important to clear it, why the Israelis have chosen this particular time to do this atrocities. It's part of the complete plan which we have been listening through the news of what is called the ultimate deal, or the deal of century, where Jerusalem has to be shifted to the Israelis under the auspice of the American administration. The Israelis are planning for the last 4 years to do the same program as they have done in Hebrew. They want to divide Al-Aqsa Mosque temporarily and spatially between Muslims and the Jews, where it is mosque. The mosque is for Muslims, even in encyclopedias and in everywhere. Mm-hmm. Now, their writers, their scholars, they are trying to fabricate history and claim that Bab al-Rahma is in Torah has been mentioned, the gate to their own temple mount. This means nothing to us. Again, the people are deciding to come and prevent all those atrocities, to prevent the spatial and temporal division of Al-Aqsa Mosque as a part of the ultimate deal and the century deal of which has been proposed by Trump to take away the Palestinians from West Bank and from Jerusalem.
Right, and this is a deal that is highly anticipated. And Mr. Ahmed, not only is this narrative out in the open, something that is being vigorously talked about, but also the fact that Al-Aqsa Mosque the plan is to turn the area into a Jewish praying section. And now, doesn't this, whether it's true or not, add to a sort of almost prodding the Palestinians, almost prodding the Muslims to react? Is this in a way to try and instigate them?
Absolutely. That what's happening with the Jewish nation law that recently was passed is an apartheid act from the side of the Israelis. It's an apartheid state. To be fair, what they're doing, they're just empowering the Jewish people, and they're banning the indigenous population of that region from their own rights. They're preventing the Palestinians from moving and entering the Al-Aqsa compound. It's the place where all the Muslims need to go and do pilgrimage. What the Israelis is doing is by every day, every night, they're practicing these illegal acts. And that would provoke a kind of a reaction from the Palestinian young people. Some of them use knives to kill Israelis. And then the Israeli propaganda started saying that the Palestinians are terrorists killing the Israeli. Look, they're innocent Israelis. But the question is, again, why they are there, why the Israeli soldiers are in that territory. It's an Palestinian land by the act of the international law. According to the United Nations, it's an occupied territory. Right. So the first solution is to withdraw from this region.
Right. And you know what I find really interesting is when the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu comes out and he tweets, and this is on the Christchurch massacre that took place. Let me read out what he says. Israel mourns the wanton murder of innocent worshippers in Christchurch and condemns the brazen act of terror in New Zealand. Now, isn't this a huge contrast to what is actually unfolding in East Jerusalem, Dr. Khalid? Do you see, or is it just me seeing the hypocrisy here?
They are very good actors and exploiters. You know, let me just say two things on that. First, these very tweets remind us with the previous Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, in 2002, when he has break into Al-Aqsa Mosque and it has instigated the second Intifada. He said that I came to live in peace with Palestinians. What sort of peace and what is the meaning of peace he means? This is exactly what he means. To kill, to snatch those holy sites, to desacrate those holy shrines. This is what they mean by this thing. This is one. The second thing, a question to us, what has encouraged them to say such statements, such disgusting statements? It is because that we are witnessing the Prime Minister of Israel as a state guest in our capitals, unfortunately, that we are still witnessing those endeavors for the normalization of relations at the official level with the Israeli entity. Look at our nation and the people, the masses in the streets. They are very, very active in supporting and in solidarity with the Palestinian issue. Our people in Gaza, they are on the fence every Friday. Our people in Jerusalem, they are doing their level best to safeguard the Holy Shrine and their identity from Judaization plan of the Israeli enemy. Yesterday, as Professor was saying, that a common man, a common youngster moved maybe with a knife, and yesterday rather he was having nothing. And because of his internal rage and anger to this complete silence from the international community, he attacked a uniform of officers of Israelis, took their guns and fired at them. This is our people. It's time to the official level to stop this stupid and shameful activities of receiving Netanyahu and the Israeli figures, to no know very well the normalization activities of relation with the Israeli entity is simply a dagger in the back of our
dagger in the back. But let me ask Mr. Ahmed, Right, Dr. Khalid, hang on. Let's ask Mr. Ahmed. Right, sorry. Let's ask Mr. Ahmed. Mr. Ahmed, is this really the problem here, or the solution to this problem, to not open a dialogue with whoever the Israeli leadership is, or the leadership that supports Israel's existence, or is there another solution to this?
That's another elephant in the room. What happened for more than 25 years, the Palestinians and the Israelis have been negotiating a two-state solution. And now Benjamin Netanyahu is saying clearly that it's the one-state solution. So what do you expect them to, what do you expect the Palestinian to think? What kind of solutions they're looking for? The problem is, again, the Palestinians are open to any kind of solutions, but who is going to broker that? Even Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian partner of the peace process, does not rely on the Israeli side. He clearly says that Benjamin Netanyahu is a terrorist to some extent. The Israelis are not respecting the deals that they've been striking with the Palestinians for the past 25 years. Now we have a moribund, a complete dead peace process, and the Israelis are continuing with their unilateral acts on the ground, completely disregarding any concerns of the international community or the Muslim world or the Palestinians.
But
so the question
Abbas,
is,
you mentioned Mahmoud Abbas, while he criticizes Benjamin Netanyahu, the problem is he doesn't have the right support himself of his own people, does he? I mean, like, all his political factions are at loggerheads right now.
He does have, Mahmoud Abbas is still the Palestinian president. Hamas has serious problem, that is the rival of Fatah or the opponent of Mahmoud Abbas. They do have serious problems with Mahmoud Abbas that led to a Palestinian division or the conflict between the two Palestinian factions. But at the end of the day, Mahmoud Abbas is still the president of the Palestinian people. And I believe that all of them are supporting him just under one condition: if the Israelis are offering genuine resolutions. What is happening is the Israelis are hijacking the whole cause. They're kind of unilaterally taking whatever they're thinking of without giving any concern to the Palestinian problems.
I wonder if Dr. Khalid agrees with this, because with the nomination and the appointment of the new Prime Minister, Mohammed Shatayyeh, there's been so much criticism from Hamas on not being brought within the conversation of appointing a leader. Dr. Khalid, what's your take on it? Is there strong support behind Mahmoud Abbas or not?
Actually, I mean, I will let the figures speak instead of that. We have won in 2006 the majority of the seats, and we formed the government, and we were not allowed to run for a single day. Mahmoud Abbas today is punishing our people in Gaza and stopping the gas and water and electricity over Gaza. And I don't know whether he's having such a mandate. But on the other hand, I don't want to waste the time of the audience to go for those things, because they can refer to the figures and that. And I'm not concerned about this thing, because I'm concerned with a division is happening which weaken our stance as Palestinians. On the other hand, let me clarify about the dialogue issue, which is very important to me. Your question as if there was no dialogue between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's been a dialogue since, as Professor was saying, since 1991. And what we have ended today is that 80% of land has been given to the Israelis, and the remaining 20%, 2% of it is Jerusalem. And the Israelis are saying that this is off the table. It is a united eternal capital of Israel, and the remaining 18% is divided into 3 zones: A, B, C, 20, 40%, and with the majority, or 60% with the majority among the Israelis. And what dialogue we are talking about it over here? There is no sense of a dialogue.
There's no sense of a dialogue.
So when you want to go for a dialogue, there is a rule of a table. A rule of a table, you should be at least equal on both sides to talk to each other.
And there's also
the basic fundamentals. If you allow me for a few seconds, then I'll allow you.
I'm sorry, we're so quickly running out of time.
We have to understand the right to self-determination is to implement the withdrawal of what is being recognized as an occupied territory by the Israeli army. The international community said that at least 1967 areas is occupied.
Okay,
where is the international community? Where is Mahmoud Abbas on that? Who is
right? Now hold that thought, Dr. Khalid. We're wrapping up because we're out of time now. But really, Mr. Ahmed, I want your closing remarks on this, especially in context with while Dr. Khalid talks about a dialogue or the lack thereof. There's also the question about the mediator. We'd seen it in Camp David. This happened. Palestinians were not part of that conversation where this agreement was made. If the U.S. government is the arbitrator here, they're clearly backing Israel. Will there ever be a solution?
There will never be a solution as far as the United States is the only and exclusive mediator for the peace process. That's what Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president himself, stated, simply because the Americans are saying they're impartial, they're partial, and they're completely biased to the Israeli narrative. And in that case, this is going to kind of jeopardize the whole peace process, and simply because they're not fair in terms of brokering a deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So there must be a United Nations kind of entity, or talks are very important for this in order to solve the problem. If the international community and the international world knows that we need to solve the problem, this is the only way to do it. Otherwise, the cycles of violence is going to continue. Killing from both sides will continue. That's something nobody is interested to see. So it's either an intervention with impartial role of a broker, a fair and just, right, along with the United States, could be China, could be Russia, could be the United Nations. But at the end of the day, the United States completely failed to come out with a solution with the different successive administrations they have, Obama, Clinton, and now Donald Trump.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed Alioglu there and Dr. Khalid, for your valuable insight here on Newswire. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for this story. We're going to take a quick short break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Aiza Umar. Now, on Friday, 15th of March, a group of Muslims observing Friday prayers were gunned down in two separate mosques. By the end of the day, in fact, 24 hours later, 50 were declared dead, including 9 Pakistanis, and scores were injured. 4 people were arrested, 3 men and a woman, including a 28-year-old Australian, Brenton Tarrant, a self-described white supremacist who has been charged with murder. This incident has left the community reeling in New Zealand. It took place in a city called Christchurch. Now, the Prime Minister of New Zealand has condemned the attacks and has been seen visiting Muslims and community members in Christchurch while draped in a black scarf. She spoke to them, sharing words of support. Let's take a listen to what she said.
New Zealand is united in its grief, and we are united in our grief. And so I convey that message of love and support on behalf of New Zealand to all of you. This is not New Zealand. The only part of the incident and actions that we have seen over the past 24, 36 hours that is New Zealand is the support that you are seeing now. But nothing that led up to it is who we are or is who this city is. Now, this act of terror was brought to our shores and rained down upon us.
Now, while the entire community, irrespective of race and religion, they reel from the onslaught of what this violence in an otherwise largely peaceful community is taking place, critics are debating around the world whether this is an isolated incident or something that we should have expected. When we see senior politicians, especially at a time so critical for humanity and for the global community in itself to reach out and promote interfaith harmony, instead what we see coming out of them is just speech that basically spurs on violence and bigotry. It really highlights the other face of terrorism that we refuse to talk about, whether it's in the media or in social media or across the board in conversations taking place in our homes. That is the terrorism, that side of terrorism that is not connected to Islam, which is generally the case when we talk about terrorism around the world. It inevitably is always connected to Muslims, but this one isn't. This is what is commonly known as the Great Replacement Movement or the White Genocide, a right-wing, hardline white supremacist agenda that calls for the elimination of non-white representation, especially of Muslims. So when the Australian Senator Fraser Anning posted this on a government letterhead just 10 minutes after this attack took place, let me quickly read out to you what it says. And I quote here, he wrote, "The real cause of bloodshed on New Zealand streets today is the immigration program, which allowed Muslim fanatics to migrate to New Zealand in the first place." And then he goes on to say, which is basically the crux of it, is that the entire religion of Islam is a violent ideology. And also that while the victims were Muslims in Christchurch, they are otherwise always the perpetrators of violence and terrorism around the world. Now, there was obviously a huge uproar to this. People from all walks of life came out and they condemned the statement. Malcolm Turnbull, the former PM of Australia, in response tweeted calling this hate speech. He said, "I condemned Fraser Anning's appalling maiden speech on August 15 last year as well. And I concluded with a reminder that we must have zero tolerance for hate speech." Then another Australian MP, he came out, Martin Pakula, he tweeted, "Never has our democracy been so debased as it is by the presence of that piece of human garbage, Fraser Anning, in our Senate." When he's tweeted in the last 15 minutes is almost beyond belief. And among the many other voices of protest and condemnation, which we obviously can't go through all of them, was Australian political and cultural journalist Daisy Cousin said on Twitter in response to Fraser Anning, "This is absolutely reprehensible from Fraser Anning. How dare he blame the victims? This is exactly the reaction the monsters who did this wanted. Despicable, disgraceful." So when we see this kind of conversation taking place, it really brings out a larger narrative that is not being addressed overall, whether it's in media or otherwise. And for that, I would like to bring in our guests who will be talking to us about this issue, whether it is the white supremacy agenda, is that what we can call it, or is this a general spate of incidents against Muslims that are increasing around the world? So let's talk to our guests. I'd like to introduce right now Ms. Linda Hayoki. She is the Senior Research Associate for the Center of Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. Also, we have with us from London, Barrister Francis O with us, and also Ms. Shafika Athalai, an analyst at International Coordination at the Collective Against Islamophobia in France. I'd like to welcome all three of you for taking out the time and speaking to us here on a Newswire. Ms. Linda, if in your view, what has happened in Christchurch, the mowing down of all these Muslims, is this something unprecedented? Would you call it an isolated incident?
No, I would actually not, because obviously it is clear that at the moment we have a very strong tendency of Islamophobic politics going on everywhere in the West. I would also say that Islamophobia as such is a phenomenon that has only appeared after the 9/11 context, because this is a continuum of an historical phenomenon that is connected to Orientalism and colonialism of the European imperialist powers in Muslim lands in general. So I am not surprised that this happened in New Zealand, and I generally do think that nobody shouldn't be surprised.
The manifesto that was published by the shooter, Brenton Tarrant, it was accessible online. There was a video that he shot of him while going through the two mosques, and it was broadcast live on social media. So the whole question whether hate speech available like this and is easily accessible, is there an international law against it? Is there something that can be used to stop inciting violence? Mr. Francis, could you shed some light on that?
International law, because this is something that would be dealt with by individual states. That there are obligations, international treaty obligations, to ensure that communities are treated without discrimination, and that law enforcement protects all minorities. So to that extent, there is an international law dimension, but ultimately this is a matter for individual states. New Zealand has a very similar legal system to Pakistan and to England and Wales and Scotland, and I imagine that there are laws there that are deal with this in the criminal sense and in the civil sense also. So there are laws such as incitement, racial. In England and Wales, I'm not entirely sure about in New Zealand, but religiously aggravated offences exist, and can be taken into account always in sentencing. And in addition, of course, there are laws against discrimination in a wider context.
Right. So, Ms. Shafiqa, something that Ms. Linda highlighted, these incidents seem to be on the rise since post 9/11. Is this something you agree with? Are we seeing more and more of these attacks against Muslims?
Yeah, of course, I agree. So to give you some figures, in 2003, there were in France 182 Islamophobic acts. And then in 2015, so during the state of emergency, we got 905 Islamophobic acts. So it is hugely increasing.
Why is there such a rise?
There is such a rise because of the media, the political speeches, because of the scare. The other is seen as a stranger, as a threat. There is an ignorance of what religion is. There is a spirit of war. For example, straight after the attacks, straight after the killings in New Zealand, you got Catherine Blind. It's a political representative of the extreme right party. She said an eye for an eye. So these political speeches is clearly a reason of Islamophobia.
Right. And Ms. Linda, would you also like to highlight whether you think this is the same reason that, in a way, what I'm getting the sense of is with globalization, with technology, with the ease of access to information from across the world where everybody can have an opinion, everyone can put it out there on the internet. Is this also counterproductive because it allows the incitement of violence and hatred towards each other and hence the target of Muslims?
Yes, I would definitely agree that especially the normalization of hate speech by politicians is something that actually fuels the common folks. It's basically a justification for their own ideas and execution of their hate crimes towards Muslim citizens everywhere in the world, basically, not just in the West.
It's interesting here, Mr. Francis, I wonder if you shed some light on this. When politicians go out there, whether on campaign trails or in important international leadership forums, it really brings into question how much of what they say against a certain sect or religion can be allowed by international law, or can they be prosecuted in an international court of justice? Because is there any kind of law out there for this?
Well, not in the International Court of Justice, because that's essentially an arbitrator between states. And international law, as I say, is generally speaking the law of relations between states. There are some obligations that states have to ensure the protection of minorities, as I said, but generally speaking, those issues are dealt with within states. As for hate speech, there is a line that we draw generally in common law countries, which is that where speech is so serious that it incites violence, that is the extent to which we will punish it criminally. There are also other civil liabilities such as libel, but which doesn't affect this issue as much. But my view is that is broadly the right line. Now, there have been politicians in the past from extreme parties who have been prosecuted and convicted of incitement offences, and not just politicians, but extreme religious leaders and other figures of that nature. That should certainly be done, perhaps more than it is done now. Because that is, I think we have an armoury of legal ways in which we can deal with this. Clearly, that doesn't extend to banning any speech that may be seen as distasteful or offensive, but it does mean that you can and you should prosecute individuals who are inciting violence and racial hatred.
Is there sorry to interrupt you there, Mr. Francis, sorry to interrupt you there, but is there really any kind of grey area where the jury is out in trying to decide where is it that one would call it that this is an infrastructure where it's radicalizing people online? Is there any kind of gray area regarding this, or is there clarity, especially, for example, right now, what we're seeing in the world today is these kind of incidents on the rise where Muslims are being targeted, whether in peaceful communities or in conflict zones or whatever. So there is an entire agenda that we call the right-wing ideological infrastructure, which is promoting this. Now, is this something which is being recognized, or is this still something evolving too new to put any kind of hard, concrete law on?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point, because it isn't just political figures speaking on the usual traditional media. It is also, as you've said, social media. And there are a large number of there's a certain amount of evidence that this character Tarrant was influenced by Breivik and others who operate in some sort of dark web on the internet. Now, that is, of course, a very important additional area where we need to be very vigilant as to how we prevent those sorts of meetings. But it's difficult, because often this is done in a non-public forums. Sometimes, though, it is done in public forums, and that, of course, leads to questions about how and to what extent one, as internet providers and as states, we can ensure that those are brought offline where they should be, because clearly many of these fora where plots have been done and where ideas have been spread are inherently illegal.
No, it's
because they spread.
Right. No, the reason I ask you this is because I'm glad you raised this point. This is something that Brenton himself wrote in that manifesto that he released. He, in fact, emailed it to the Prime Minister of New Zealand just 10 minutes before he went out on his rampage. And he said that one of the people who influenced him the most was Candace Owens. And now she's an African-American conservative, who is known for her pro-Trump views and also famous for her anti-Black Lives Matter views. Now, again, like, she is a public figure. You see her on TV. She's easily accessible on YouTube. And when she comes out there and says things that influence a person to an extent that he pulls out like heavy equipment, military guns, and shoots down people, it really brings into question that where is the law on this? Is there, I mean, how far can we go before it becomes a suffocating degree of silence?
Well, I'm not going to comment on that individual instance and that individual politician. But the question is not whether or not somebody says he's influenced by an individual. It's whether objectively what that individual says is or could be seen as incitement to criminal offence, criminal activity, or incitement to racial hatred, which it requires incitement to commit violence. So that is the test. And I think it's very important that we focus on the correct test, because it will always be the case that you can never know who is going to be influenced by certain remarks. And we do have a very important rights of freedom of speech as well. And political discourse, but that of course has to be tempered with the importance of securing protection for minorities and preventing incitement. So you said earlier, is there a grey area? There are always grey areas. That is the function, and you also said, is the jury out on it? That is the function of a jury in a criminal trial or a judge in a civil trial, to determine whether that grey area falls on one side of the line or another. So there will always be that.
Okay, so Ms. Linda, let me pull you into this conversation. The UAC called an emergency meeting. We see different Muslim leaders coming forth and condemning the attack. Do you feel the Muslim community is united enough to right now take this as an opportunity to take a strong stand?
Well, I am not really sure about that, because I feel like we should all, first of all, be aware of the fact how we want to tackle this issue. Muslim communities are spread all over the world in general, and all communities have to still think about the whole social political context in which they live in. So I'm not just talking about majority Muslim countries, but also Muslim communities in non-Muslim countries. But I do generally feel like there has been a strong unity in terms of advocating peaceful reactions, and people do not want to respond with hate to hate, which I think is a very good response.
Right. Do you agree with this opinion, or what is your take? Is the Muslim community aligned together, strong enough for them to take a concrete stand against what we are seeing as an increase in Islamophobia across the world?
It's always the same response. Why are these attacks not condemned as terrorist attacks? However, what I find interesting here is that if we read the manifesto of the attacker, he himself defines himself as a terrorist. So I think it should be allowed to speak of this person and of this attack with his own terms, which is a white supremacist terrorist attack indeed.
And there's something also in the manifesto that he continues to outline, and it seems like there is a similarity, not in what he says, but in earlier examples of this also, where he says the reasons for his attack include that the Muslims are invaders and our lands will be their lands if we don't do something about it. There seems to be this sort of insecurity that stems from the manifesto that the Muslims, there are more, he mentions at one place with the high birth, fertility, birth rates, and sort of taking over slowly. What does this represent? Is this a threat, something that we've seen?
I think this is a general trend. If we look at the fear-mongering that is happening in the Islamophobic general discourse, in Europe we have theories, conspiracy theories such as the Eurabia, and politicians are talking about Islamization of Europe. However, at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, are the birth rates actually really that much more bigger than those of non-Muslims? Even more, I find it interesting that he basically, in the manifesto, he said that he doesn't express any explicit hate towards Muslims who live in their lands, but Muslims who come to our lands. And especially concerning, I found the fact that he said that the hate that he has towards convert Muslims is so big, because he basically condemned convert Muslims as traitors of their own nation. So I see that there is definitely a very strong racist component behind this, and it goes all the way back to the history as well. If we think about, for example, the genocide of Bosnian Muslims in the 90s, and of course he also referred to that by calling himself as a part-time kebab removalist. I mean, this was a very straight reference to the genocide of Bosnian Muslims.
All right, thank you so much there, Ms. Linda and Mr. Francis, for your input, and Ms. Shafiqa also. This is unfortunately all the time we have to discuss a topic this as heavy as whether this is Islamophobia, an isolated incident, or a larger narrative that is taking place while the world completely sees through it, does not recognize it, or doesn't want to address it. But we'll get to that in detail some other time. Right now, that's all the time we have. We'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.